Video games have been blamed for a lot of things over the years. Violence, addiction, laziness, bad grades. But some games didn't just get blamed for things. They got banned, pulled from shelves, refused classification, recalled entirely. And in at least one case, owning a copy could land you in prison with a $50,000 fine. Today we're going through every truly disturbing banned video game and explaining exactly what they contained, what happened when the world found out, and why some of these stories are even stranger than the games themselves. Before we get into it, I want to make something clear. This video isn't about jump scares or horror games that are just a little creepy. We're talking about games so extreme, so offensive, or so genuinely dangerous in the wrong hands that governments, corporations, and in some cases the United Nations stepped in. Let's start from the beginning. Cast your mind back to 1982. The gaming industry is still finding its feet. Atari rules the world. And then a company called Mystique releases a game called Custer's Revenge for the Atari 2600. Now, the graphics are blocky and primitive, even by the standards of the time, but what the game asked you to do was absolutely indefensible. You played as a naked General Custer, crossing a field while dodging arrows, with the goal of reaching a Native American woman who was tied to a pole. Once you reached her, the game depicted a sexual assault. That's the game. That's the whole game. Women's rights groups and Native American groups organized protests outside stores. When the designers publicly claimed that the woman was actually giving consent, the backlash became even louder, and rightfully so. Even today, it sits as one of the most offensive things ever put on a cartridge, and it was released in living rooms across America while families were still figuring out what this new video game thing even was. A decade later, in 1992, two games caused enough chaos that the United States Senate literally had to get involved. The first was Mortal Kombat. You've probably heard of it. The idea of being able to rip a character spying out clean from their body or punch someone's head off clean off their shoulders was something nobody had ever seen in a game before. Parents were horrified, senators were horrified, and in Germany, the game was outright banned for over 20 years. It wasn't made legal there until 2017. The second game dragged into those Senate hearings was Night Trap, and this one is genuinely fascinating because of how overblown the reaction was. Night Trap was a live-action video game where you used security cameras to protect a group of girls at a slumber party from what the game called vampires. There was no blood in Night Trap. The vampires were just guys in black jumpsuits. But the Senate claimed it promoted violence against women. Toys R Us pulled it from shelves, and the whole spectacle, both Mortal Kombat and Night Trap together, directly resulted in the creation of the ESRB, the rating system that labels every game you buy today. Two games, one of which had no blood at all, permanently changed how the entire industry operates. In 1990, while most people were playing Mario, a German developer quietly released something called KZ Manager. The name is a shortened version of Konzentrationslager, which is the German word for concentration camp, because that's what it is, a management simulator where the player runs a Nazi concentration camp. You manage resources, including Cyclone B gas. You manage public opinion. It was not a satire. It was not a commentary. It was exactly what it looked like. Today, in Germany, it is a serious criminal offense to possess or distribute this game, not just to sell it, to own it. It falls under German laws against the glorification of the Nazi regime, laws that exist for very clear historical reasons. Moving into the mid-90s, a racing game called Carmageddon came out in 1997, and it had a very simple premise. You could win the race by actually finishing the race, or you can win by running over every single pedestrian on the map. The game tracked them, counted them, rewarded you for it. To get the game released in the UK and Germany, developers had to replace all the human pedestrians with zombies who bled green, and then with robots who leaked black oil instead of blood. They essentially shipped 3 different versions of the same game depending on where you lived. Years later, a patch was released that restored the original humans, because the developers had kept it ready the entire time. Also in 1997, a game called Postal arrived. It was dark, it was isometric, and the story was that the Earth had been infected with a hate plague, and you were one of the infected. The sequel came in 2003, and it became the version that really pushed things over the edge. Postal 2 was a sandbox where the premise started mundane. doing errands, buying milk, going to the library, but each task would spiral into mass violence. You could use a cat as a makeshift silencer for a shotgun. You could urinate on people. The game included a section where you fought Al-Qaeda members in a grocery store. New Zealand banned it so hard that simply owning a copy could result in a $50,000 fine or actual jail time. Australia and Malaysia banned it as well. And in 1998, a game called Thrill Kill came extremely close to existing. It was a 4-player fighting game set in hell, with characters like a plastic surgeon who fought using oversized needles and a character who used his own severed limb as a weapon. The game was, by all accounts, about 99% complete and ready to ship. Then Electronic Arts bought the developer and made the decision to cancel it entirely just weeks before release, calling it too vile to put on shelves. They never released it. They never sold the rights, they just killed it. But someone leaked the game online, and Thrill Kill became one of the most famous pieces of lost media in gaming history, passed around on burned discs and later emulation sites for decades. In 2002, a game simply called Ethnic Cleansing was released by a neo-Nazi organization called Resistance Records. There's no softening how to describe this. You played as either a skinhead or a Klansman moving through a city and a subway system, killing black people, Latino people, and Jewish people. It was explicitly designed not to entertain but to recruit. It was meant to be a gateway into hate group ideology. It is one of the only games in history that was banned not because of general violence or adult content, but because governments classified it as a hate crime in software form, globally. The organization behind it wanted to radicalize teenagers with a video game, and they almost got away with distributing it before the world caught on. In 2004, Rockstar Games released Manhunt. You played as a death row inmate forced to star in a series of snuff films for a twisted director. The game's central mechanic was its execution system, sneaking up behind enemies and killing them using everyday objects, and the longer you waited in the shadows before striking, the more brutal the animation. A plastic bag for a quick kill, a glass shard for something worse, a machete for the longest wait. In 2004, the murder of a 14-year-old named Stefan Pereira in the UK was blamed directly on this game by his parents and the British media. It dominated headlines. The game was pulled from shelves across the country. And then the investigation revealed that the game didn't even belong to the killer. It belonged to the victim. The killer had never played it. The game had been used as a scapegoat, but the ban stayed. New Zealand, Germany, and Australia all added it to their lists. Canada went further, classifying it legally as a film, which effectively banned it from retail entirely. The sequel, Manhunt 2, came out in 2007 and caused its own separate disaster. The original version of the game was rated adults only by the ESRB, which sounds like it should just mean restricted to adults, but in practice it was a death sentence. Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo all had policies refusing to allow adults-only games on their platforms, so Rockstar added a psychedelic blur filter over every execution sequence, submitted it again, and got a mature rating. The UK and Ireland still refused to classify it at all, calling it gratuitously cruel beyond what any filter could fix. In 2006, two very different games created two very different scandals. The first was Rule of Rose, a psychological horror game about a young woman trapped in a 1930s orphanage controlled by a group of cruel children. It was actually a quiet, layered story about childhood trauma and cruelty, but rumors spread through UK media that the game involved burying children alive and contained sexualized violence toward minors. None of it was accurate, but the mayor of Rome weighed in. The European Union Justice Commissioner called for it to be banned. The publisher, rather than fight the wave of misinformation, simply canceled the UK release altogether. A nuanced horror game about real childhood pain never reached its audience because of a moral panic built almost entirely on false descriptions of what the game actually was. The second 2006 game was different in every way. Rapeplay was a Japanese adult game that depicted a man stalking and assaulting a mother and her two daughters. It was never meant to leave Japan, but in 2009, someone found it listed on Amazon, and the international reaction was immediate and enormous. The UK government banned the import of similar games. Amazon removed its entire catalog of Japanese adult games. The game that was never supposed to be seen outside one country ended up reshaping international digital retail policy. In 2015, a game called Hatred arrived with a simple, stripped-down premise. You played as a man called the antagonist, who despised humanity and decided to kill as many people as possible. The game was rendered entirely in black and white, except for the color of fire and blood. Executions were slow and cinematic. Steam removed it from their storefront within hours of it being listed. Then something strange happened. public discourse shifted toward conversations about censorship and whether Steam had the right to decide what adults could buy. Gabe Newell, the CEO of Valve, personally emailed the developers, apologized, and put the game back on the platform. It remains available to this day. 3 years later, in 2018, a horror game called Agony was released, set in a version of hell filled with grotesque imagery. The original build of the game included a puzzle where players had to crush infants to progress through a level. Developers removed this section entirely to avoid a permanent classification refusal and the adults-only rating that would have killed retail sales. The version most people played was already considered extreme. That scene never made the final cut. What's strange about looking at all of these cases together is how different the reasons for banning each one actually are. Some were banned for graphic violence, some for sexual content, one for racial hatred, one because a 17-year-old appeared in footage that was marketed to adults, one for a scene that was eventually cut before anyone even played it, and one because of newspaper coverage that completely fabricated what the game contained. Governments don't agree on where the line is. The gaming industry has never agreed either, and the more you look at specific cases, the harder it becomes to draw a single, clean rule that explains all of them. The one thing they all share is that someone, somewhere, decided the content crossed the boundary that normal society couldn't accept. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes the panic was the story, not the game. And in almost every case, the ban made people want to find it more. If you made it this far, drop a comment with which one surprised you most. Subscribe if you want more videos like this, and check the links below if you want to go deeper on any of these cases.